Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. As we continue our discussion of the Harlem Renaissance, in this lecture we're going to be focusing on one of its best known artistic expressions, what's been considered and called the first truly American art form, jazz music. The Harlem Renaissance was a flowering of black culture, literature, music, and the arts that was born in the mindset of black pride and self-expression that we've described in previous lectures that was expressed by Marcus Garvey, Alain Locke, Claude McKay, and others. As one writer wrote, Negro life is seizing its first chances for group expression and self-determination. One of the great figures of the Harlem Renaissance was the writer Langston Hughes, who declared, "I am a Negro and beautiful." This was such a new mindset at that time. Blacks had generally spent their entire lives and much of their history being told they were inferior. Hughes and others struggled to celebrate the African heritage of blacks and yet also remain American at the same time. We might attribute the development of an African American identity to Hughes and others in this movement. At the time, this idea was described as the new Negro, who was militant and proud of his race, yet also wanted to participate fully in American society. The Renaissance was born from Marcus Garvey's preachings as well as the growth of an educated black generation. Many artists in the movement benefited from the first black history courses, which were taught at a few colleges during the First World War. The Renaissance found expression in several black periodicals, most notably The Crisis, which was the NAACP publication, published by W.E.B. Du Bois, who himself had led the movement among black intellectuals for decades. The Crisis published many of the stories and poems of the writers and artists of the Harlem Renaissance. Other prominent publications that published the work of black writers and artists was Opportunity, published by the National Urban League, The Messenger, a journal published by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and The Negro World, which was Marcus Garvey's newspaper for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. The Renaissance was also in many ways supported by whites. Whites were drawn to the jazz and dance clubs in Harlem, where they paid for the performers and the drinks, and where blacks often were allowed only to perform, not to enter as paying guests. White audiences also bought the books written by black authors, and white philanthropic organizations provided grants, awards, and scholarships for top black artists. Occasionally, this white support and finance created a conflict of interest with some of the artists. White readers often hoped for stories that accentuated the stereotypes of blacks as lewd and savage beings. Black writers, many of whom did write about these kind of acts, sought to do so on their own terms. They were creating art, not pornography. In some cases, blacks turned down a tempting financial reward to publish works that satisfied white cravings for stories of wild black exploits. Langston Hughes himself once refused a grant after being told his writing was not primitive enough. The Harlem Renaissance might be most closely associated with the new cultural expression and art form of jazz. Indeed, the 1920s are sometimes referred to as the Jazz Age. This was a musical form born largely in the dance halls and bordellos of New Orleans, but it was a mixture of earlier art forms such as ragtime and the blues, with a sprinkling of African cultural music and other styles. It was popular among white listeners, but mostly performed by blacks, which gave them an avenue for venting frustrations with life and societal limitations. Among the leaders of this movement were the singer Bessie Smith, the trumpeter and singer Louis Armstrong, and others. Jazz music slowly became a national and even worldwide sensation, again growing out of New Orleans and a handful of other cities to become known around the world. It was initiated in the early 1900s with a handful of recordings that came to be known as race records by some of the leading black singers, including Bessie Smith and others like Alberta Hunter, Clara Smith, and Ma Rainey. A number of these had been performing for years on the vaudeville circuit and gradually began to achieve fame in their own right. In the 20s, jazz orchestras began to grow in size and incorporate new instruments and means of performance, and ultimately the age was known for some of the big bands that were led by performers like Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, and others, and also occasionally white bands led by other performers, including one named Paul Whiteman, who was probably the leading white jazz performer and writer of that era. Dance forms like the Charleston and tap dance, which were linked with jazz music, also became wildly popular in the 1920s. Spurred on by the popularity of jazz music, what became known as a Negro Vogue erupted in cities like New York and Paris, as white viewers and listeners became obsessed with the black art form. This was spurred on by a number of writers and critics whose writings encouraged the popularity of black musicians. Certainly the most popular of these critics was Carl Van Vechten, who was a music critic who trumpeted the importance and greatness of jazz and blues music. Van Vechten also became an important contact for many black artists and performers, and in some ways he held the keys to the kingdom to popular nightclubs such as the Cotton Club, where blacks were allowed only to perform and not in the audience. Other clubs were known as Black and Tans, where the audience could be mixed, and there were some clubs that performed before all black audiences as well. The most popular of the jazz artists in the 20s was Louis Armstrong, who was born in 1901 in New Orleans and ultimately came to have the nickname Satchel Mouth or Satchmo because of his huge, gleaming smile. He grew up impoverished and at one point was arrested for firing a gun in the streets and thrown into a youth prison. It was there that he was introduced to music, and he grabbed onto it. He began performing at a young age and caught on with one of the better traveling bands of that time. Eventually, he moved on to forge a solo career by the mid-1920s, moved to New York, and then on to Chicago. He was known as a great improviser and performer at the trumpet. He poured his soul into his performances, performed with a huge smile, drenched in sweat, constantly wiping himself with a handkerchief. He gave his all to every performance, and I encourage you to look up some of his live performances on YouTube to get a sense of what they were like. His rendition of the previously recorded song West End Blues helped to refine and reshape the limits of jazz music. His early hits not only included ripping trumpet solos, but the novel use of timing and syncopation that revolutionized jazz. Later in his career, he was a staple of radio and television programs, with a band called the Hot Five and later the Hot Seven. This inspired Playboy magazine to write at one point, "What was the greatest band of the 20th century? Forget the Beatles. It was Louis Armstrong's Hot Five, and its subsequent incarnation, the Hot Seven. These bands altered the course of popular music." Armstrong's career spanned well into the 1960s, as he had huge hits late in his career, like 1964's Hello Dolly and 1968's What a Wonderful World, remaining to this day some of the songs he's best known for. He recorded music almost to the day he died in 1971. The Harlem Renaissance also saw blacks flourish in the theater and in more traditional musical arenas as well. Paul Robeson was perhaps the most famous of black actors, performing roles in prominent theaters that only white actors had done before. And black singers, too, broke down barriers, led by the tenor Roland Hayes, who was the first black to be accepted into many concert halls. While the Harlem Renaissance is, of course, best known for its jazz musicians, it is also well known and celebrated for its writers, which we'll discuss in the next lecture.